Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Taurus and Taurus Rising for February of 2019. So tonight I'm trying out doing a live stream where I'm live streaming my horoscopes to Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube at the same time simultaneously. So if you're watching this live, then you should be watching on one of those platforms already. Otherwise, it's something that I'm hoping to experiment with and do more often in the future, so be sure to subscribe to one of those three places, either the Astrology School on YouTube, Chris Brennan 7 on Twitter, or just search for Chris Brennan on Facebook and you'll find me. All right, so we're going to be looking at the horoscopes for February. I'm going to be pulling up a few different charts here. So on the one hand, we have the ingress chart, which shows the exact days that different planets move into different signs this month. It also shows the dates of the two lunations on the 4th and the 19th, which is a full moon, a new moon in Aquarius, and a full moon in Virgo. We've also got the planetary movements chart, which is made by my friend Paula Bellumini, and which we sell. If you do a search on Amazon, you can find a poster of this by searching 2019 astrology calendar posters, and you should be able to find the bundle that we did with this. So I love this because it shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the month and how far through the signs of the zodiac they'll get by the end of the month. And you can see that some planets move very quickly through like one or two signs, and other outer planets move much more slowly, just only a few degrees through any given sign during the course of a month. All right, but the chart we're going to focus on the most is the Solar Fire Animate chart feature, where I have it set up for February 1st with Taurus Rising. So, as always, my horoscopes are primarily from the perspective of your rising sign, which should be Taurus. So I recommend, and this is like the secret that most horoscope writers take for granted, which is that if you know your rising sign, you should probably read your horoscope from the perspective of your rising sign. Because that's what the 12 houses are supposed to be derived from primarily. It's only typically if you don't know your rising sign that you should then default to your sun sign or your moon sign. However, there are some people that do really resonate very strongly with their sun sign or their moon sign, especially their sun sign if they're born during the day, or their moon sign if they were born at night. So it's fine to look at your horoscopes for all three, and there's going to be some pieces that will probably be relevant to you for all three in varying degrees, but the primary one you want to focus on is the horoscope for your rising sign. So for the purpose of this, I'm going to be focusing on those with Taurus and Taurus Rising. All right, so let's jump into it and take a look at the transits. So I just got done doing the horoscopes for Aries, and a major thing that we focused on was the shift of Mars. There's two major planetary ingresses happening this month. One of them is that in the first half of the month, Mars is moving through Aries, which for those of you with Taurus Rising is your 12th house. But then by February 14th, it actually changes signs and Mars moves into Taurus, which is your sign or your rising sign. And for those of you who it's your rising sign, that's going to be Mars moving into your first house. So that's going to be a really important, really key transit this month, and key transition that will break up the first half of the month versus the second half of the month. The other major inner planet transit that happens much earlier in the month is Venus moving out of Sagittarius and moving into Capricorn around February 3rd, February 4th. So those are the two we'll probably focus on the most this month. Let's start with Mars, since that one might be a little bit more distinct and might stand out a little bit more, since it's the only planet that's moving into your rising sign this month. So in the first half of the month, we're going to be experiencing the tail end of what Cam White and I talked about in the horoscopes for last month, for January, and that is that Mars transit through Aries and through your 12th house. So there's a couple ways you can interpret that, and we already went into this extensively, so I don't want to dwell on it too much this month. One of the ways is that sometimes the 12th house was traditionally associated with enemies or people that work at cross purposes to you. So sometimes having a transit like Mars going through the 12th house can mean greater conflict or challenges coming from the area of people who work at cross purposes to you in your life, either in terms of being sort of outright people that are antagonistic against you, or In other instances, it can just be people whose interests are not aligned with your own, and therefore it causes conflict in different ways because you're coming from different places and you have clashes as a result of that. So that's going to be a continuing trend or theme this month as a potential, and it kind of culminates towards the very end of that transit when there's a Mars-Uranus conjunction around February 12th and February 13th, right at 29 degrees of Aries before Mars leaves that sign. So Uranus is a planet that has to do with that which is unexpected, that which is disruptive, things that are sort of revolutionary in some way in your life, whatever the standard or the baseline is for that area of your life. So this Uranus transit is not something that you're unfamiliar with, because this is actually the tail end of Uranus transiting through your 12th house for the greater part of the last decade. But there is like one last sort of hurrah or one last sort of blowout that occurs here potentially with Mars hitting Uranus at this time, but then it quickly dissipates and Mars moves into your first house. So that's the point where there's a major shift in the month, because Mars moving from your 12th to the 1st can sometimes coincide with a shift of energy in terms of your own personal vitality and your just ability to get things done in a given month. So Mars in the 12th house is a much more low-key, much more reclusive, and sometimes sort of contemplative transit to have. But Mars going through the first house is a much more energetic and sometimes like vibrant or just get things done type transit. And especially for those of you with night charts where you'll tend to experience Mars transits a little bit more constructively, this is probably going to be a useful transit this month for getting some work done, for sort of re-emerging from the introspection of the Mars transit through your 12th house and starting to actually become energetic again about doing things in your life and sort of not adopting, but developing a little bit more direction or a little bit more forward momentum, let's say. For those of you who have problems with that, or who, developing energy or excitement or starting to get moving on projects, especially new projects, is kind of difficult. For those of you with Taurus Rising, having Mars go through your rising sign should be a helpful sort of energizing transit to have to sort of become a little bit more active than you would be normally. The downside of it, especially for those of you with day charts, is that Mars transiting through the first house can sometimes lead to an overabundance of energy, which can sometimes sort of flow over into other feelings like irritation or being aggravated, being quicker to anger, being more impulsive than you might typically be normally. So one of the things you want to be careful about this month is both mentally as well as physically, not necessarily sort of doing things in a way that might be too impulsive or that you might regret in retrospect, where you might have the impulse to do something suddenly, but it might be better if you slowed down and thought out your plan of action before doing so. So that sort of applies to things in general, but especially in areas where there could be conflict or where you could be the party who's more quick to anger or could be doing something brashly or rashly that you might not do in a more clear frame of mind. You want to be extra careful about that this month, because you're definitely going to be more prone to actions like that than you would be in other months. And that transit's pretty much the entire second half of February, because Mars only gets through the first part of the sign basically before the month is up. So let's move it forward to March 1st, and we see that Mars is only at 10 degrees of Taurus. So that's one of the major transits this month, and it's one of the major dividing lines. As I said, positive side is just more energy. Downside is you could be more irritable or could be more prone to conflict, so try to be careful about that. Other major transit this month is Venus, which we can see most of January it was transiting through that very lovely conjunction of Venus and Jupiter, which we saw in the morning sky just before sunrise over the course of the past few weeks. And that was going through your 8th house of shared resources, which should have exacerbated or helped to accentuate some of the positive shared financial resources transits that you've been having with Jupiter since it moved into Sagittarius a few months ago. But that transit is over by February 4th, when February 3rd, February 4th, when Venus has moved into Capricorn and into your ninth house. And the ninth house has to do with things like education, foreign travel, like long distance travel, sometimes exposure to foreign cultures and places or ideas which are foreign to you, which can sometimes tie back into the educational theme. It also has to do with broader themes having to do with religion and spirituality, and sometimes divinatory practices or occult practices like astrology or other things like that. So Venus is going to be moving through that house or that sector of your chart and activating some of those topics in your life over the course of the next month. And the primary thing is that it seems to be accentuating some long-term transits that you're having through that sign already. Pluto's been going through that house for 10 years in your chart. Saturn in particular is going through a long-term or is in the middle of a long-term transit through Capricorn and through your ninth whole sign house, where you might feel some obstacles or some restrictions that are coming up in that area that you have to decide if they're things that you can break through or if they're things that you can't get past, but instead you have to find another way or another path to take that's sort of alternative if that approach is sort of blocked off to you. But the Venus transit through here seems to be accentuating some of that, and especially for some of you with, let's say, night charts, for example, seems to probably indicating an alleviation of some of the challenges that you've been experiencing in that area of your life, which is a pretty positive transit. So that while we have some potentially more challenging stuff, certainly more energetic transit with Mars going through your first house and the potential for potentially, let's say, greater irritation as a possible theme, Venus seems to be alleviating some of the more challenging transits that you're already experiencing in your ninth house. So in general, February should be a pretty good month for ninth house topics. So that really culminates especially around the middle of the month, around February 17th, February 18th, when we have the Venus-Saturn conjunction in your ninth house. And this may lead to the removal or the alleviation of some blockages or some obstacles that you've been experiencing in terms of those ninth house topics of education, exposure, interaction to that which is foreign to you, as well as other topics potentially like religion or spirituality. For some people with Saturn going through the ninth house, I've been noticing themes of like struggling with one's beliefs or having challenges to one's belief system. And for something like this, it may be presenting you with an opportunity to reconcile some of those things that you've had to let go or had to remove from your belief system, and perhaps finding a better alternative that's more in keeping with who you are and something about your core values in life. So that transit is going on through the end of February, and looks like if we animate the chart, that Venus does not leave Capricorn until around February 28th or March 1st. So this is pretty much a transit that's dominating a large part of the month of February, and is probably more relevant to you in some ways because those of you with Taurus rising, Venus is, of course, your ruling planet. All right, so let's take a look at, I want to look at some of the other charts. I also meant to look at the chat to see if anyone's watching or paying attention to this, or if anybody has any questions. Does anybody, especially those of you with Taurus rising, does anybody have any questions or interesting stories to share about any of these transits? I know a few months ago, Lisa and I, when we did our horoscopes, I think for like October or November, we asked some questions about how some of you have been experiencing that Saturn transit through your ninth house over the past few months. And I know that we got some good stories, so I'd be curious to hear if there's any more like that people want to share. Somebody asked if this is for Taurus suns in general. It's for those with, yeah, you can look at it from the perspective of your sun sign, especially if you're born in the day, or your moon sign if your moon is in Taurus, especially if you're born at night. But I especially would look at it from the perspective of your rising sign. All right. Other questions? Somebody asked, I was born at 3:15 a.m., so am I a day or night chart? If you're born at 3 o'clock in the morning, you are a night chart. Someone asked me about starting from Pisces and going backwards. The past few months, I actually did sort of mix it up, and I did different signs out of order, but I realized I probably couldn't do that for the live stream today, because then people wouldn't be able to anticipate like what sign was coming next and things like that, and it would get a little bit out of order in terms of posting them on all three sites. So I decided them to do it in order again today, and just see how this goes, since it's a bit of an experiment. All right, any other questions? Thanks everyone for joining. All right, so let's go back to the transit charts. So one of the things I wanted to mention that I needed to mention is the lunations for this month, which is the new moon and the full moon. So for those of you with Taurus Rising, towards the beginning of the month, on February 4th, there's going to be a new moon taking place in Aquarius. And Aquarius is your 10th house of career and reputation and overall life direction. So a new moon typically represents a new beginning, or laying the seeds or foundations of something that will grow and develop over the course of the next 6 months. So that means the most general sort of interpretation or statement that we can make for that is that there's going to be a new beginning for you in terms of your career this month. So it's not necessarily going to be a huge shakeup, or necessarily, it doesn't necessarily have to be something hugely groundbreaking, but certainly a new development or a new chapter in terms of your career and overall life direction will begin this month. And it will probably begin somewhat subtly, because a new moon typically, it's when the sun and moon conjoin and the moon is at its darkest, but then after that point, the moon begins increasing in light, and it starts getting brighter and brighter and brighter until eventually it hits the full moon a couple of weeks later, and then it's at its brightest and it's most visible, so that you can really see it, and it's really illuminating everything. So new moons and full moons are kind of like that, where a new moon often, and the events surrounding them often, begin subtly, and they often indicate a change in our life or in some area of our life that's almost imperceptible at first. And people often do, in fact, overlook the significant events coinciding with them, because at the time you don't always experience them as being like hugely groundbreaking. But instead it's just sort of like something, there's a new development in that area of your life. For you, it's going to be the career, the sphere of career and your overall life direction, that then gradually will start taking up more and more importance and becoming more visible or more clear as a notable development in your life over the course of the next 6 months, until eventually there's a full moon that takes place in Aquarius in your 10th house, and then you'll sort of see the results, or you'll see that development that started in February has become a more tangible development in your life over the past 6 months that's actually notable and has led to a new direction in some way in terms of your career. So that doesn't have to be groundbreaking, but it's important, and it will be useful for you this month to pay attention to any new career developments, because they could end up having more significant, more major long-term significance than you might anticipate at first. The other major lunation that's happening this month is a full moon in Virgo, and it looks like that's taking place around the 19th, and that is happening in your 5th house. And the 5th house has to do with children, creative pursuits. So there's different sort of ways that this could be relevant. It's going to depend. For example, 5th house, if you have children, then that's going to be a major area that it will probably apply to. So it's not a new development like the new moon in Aquarius was, but instead it's a culmination of events in this sphere of your life that probably relates to something that you initiated 6 months earlier. So it could be a development in your children's life, like a child reaching a new developmental stage in their life, or having a notable development that stands out, where they'd been working on something for a long time, but then it finally reaches a state of maturity that is notable as a turning point. So this could relate to your own children or the lives of your children. Sometimes fifth house transits always also pertain to like the topic of children or the theme of children in your life in general. And sometimes if there's other people's children or people who are younger in your life, it can pertain to them as well. For other people, fifth house transits can pertain to creative pursuits, like if you have any sort of creative pursuit as an artist or a musician, or if there's something that you create in your life as a regular basis. If 6 months earlier you started working on a new technique or a new way that you're trying to express yourself in your life, at this time with the full moon in Virgo in your fifth, you could see, again, just a turning point or a culmination of events with respect to that, which, it could be positive or it could be negative, but typically as a developmental cycle, it's like pushing you forward into whatever the next chapter is in terms of that area of your life and in terms of creative pursuits. All right, so those are the two lunations that are happening this month. What are the other major transits that I meant to mention? So here's the solar fire chart again, just to look at some of that stuff. So the Mars transit, of course, through your first is like a major one in the second half of the month. We've covered that. We covered Venus moving through your ninth house. Mercury, while the Sun and Mercury are initially in your 10th house of career during the first part of the month, while they're going through Aquarius, Mercury pretty quickly moves into Pisces by February 10th, which is the house that has to do with friends and groups and alliances. And this sometimes leads to greater communications with friends and groups. This is probably going to become more relevant next month, though, in March, because we're actually getting ready for a Mercury retrograde, where Mercury's it's slowing down basically, and it's getting ready to station at 29 degrees of Pisces. So we're going to have a Mercury retrograde in your 11th house of friends and groups, although I hesitate to talk about and focus on that too much, because I know that's going to be basically a dominant theme in March that we're going to have to spend a lot of time talking about. So for this month, I would just say, because Mercury is going to enter its shadow in the second part of February, especially by the time it conjoins, shortly after it conjoins Neptune, that one of the things that you might want to strive for this month is being clear in your communications with friends. Because having not just a Mercury-Neptune conjunction in the 11th house, but also having Mercury station retrograde back and conjoin Neptune, there could be some sort of exchange or communication that you have with friends during the second part of February, where if both of you aren't entirely clear or don't strive for clear communication, there could end up being a misunderstanding, which leads to a greater sort of series of events that are problematic than you might first expect or intend. So one of the good pieces of advice probably for the second half of February is to strive for clarity in your communications as much as possible, even if it's experienced as being somewhat challenging at this time. But this is especially true when it comes to friends, groups, and alliances. All right, so I'm just looking at the other transits. Those are pretty much the main inner planet transits for this month. The rest of what's going on is largely long-term outer planet transits, with like Jupiter going through Sagittarius for a year, Saturn in the middle of going through Capricorn for 3 years, and of course next month, March, Uranus is going to go into Taurus, which is going to be a very big shakeup for those of you with Taurus Rising. And that's something we've already got a preview of during the middle of last year when Uranus first dipped into that sign. But that's something that's not fully relevant this month, because we're finishing up the very last gasps of Uranus going through Aries before we move on to that transit. All right, so I think then that brings us to the end of this horoscope, or the end of this live stream for February. I did want to check the chat one more time just to see if there's any questions that any of the Taurus Rising people have before we wrap this up, or if anybody has any interesting comments. So someone's asking, on full screen, the chat appears superimposed on the chart. Okay, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. Somebody says that they just learned of perfection years, and perfections are really useful. I had a Twitter thread about this not too long ago, and actually I have a video on my channel I would recommend that everybody check out. Just do a search for annual perfections and finding the planetary ruler of the year, and you'll find my little 10-minute introduction to annual perfections, which is really useful because it tells you which planetary transits are going to be more important for you in a given year. And especially when I'm going through the horoscopes like this each month, that's super crucial and useful information because it's going to tell you which planets you want to pay more attention to in my delineations compared to others. Like if you're in a year where Mars is activated, then that Mars transit's going to be more important to you going through your first house than other years. Whereas if you're in a Venus perfection year, then that Venus transit's going to be more important for you than it would be otherwise. So perfections are really simple. All you do is start with your ascendant or your rising sign, and you count one sign per year downward through the order of the houses, and whatever sign you come to for your current solar return year, the ruler of that sign becomes the lord of the year. So just do a search for annual perfections on YouTube and you'll find out more information about that. All right, other comments or other questions? Somebody asked if you should look at horoscopes for your stellium. Yeah, that's not a bad idea, especially because if you have a stellium of planets, which is 3 or 4 or more planets in the same sign, then there's a pretty good chance that one of those could be your ruling planet or could be a planet that's otherwise dominant in your chart. And so looking at your horoscope relative to that could be important, because at the very least, if you have a stellium in a sign, then you know those planets and that sign is going to be a focal point in your chart that any transits that are relevant that month are going to be getting sort of major aspects to. So if you have like a stellium in Taurus, then knowing that Mars is about to go through Taurus will have a somewhat similar, if not entirely the same interpretation as Mars going through the ascendant of the first house. Somebody asks a somewhat complicated natal question, and I would have to look at the actual birth chart in order to be able to answer that completely. Yeah, somebody asks about the software. So the software I'm using is SolarFire, which is available from a company called Astrolabe. They actually gave me a promo code for the podcast, which is AP15, all in caps, all in one word, 4 characters, AP15, if you want to get like a 10 or 15% discount. Somebody has a relatively good question. She says, my daughter has Taurus Rising and I see Saturn in her 9th house. She'll be having a public exam soon. Does Saturn indicate a heavy burden for her, or there exists some obstacles in passing the exam? I mean, Saturn going through the 9th house is a 3-year-long transit, so that's kind of more like a long-term transit of having a lot of responsibilities and sometimes burdens, sometimes even obstacles or challenges coming up in terms of one's education. But Venus going through there is typically more of a positive transit, especially if she has a night chart. So if it's like a short-term test that's coming up during that transit, and especially if the aspects of Venus to her natal chart look positive as Venus is transiting through her 9th house, then that would, I think, be more inclined towards like a positive or successful attempt to have a major test or an exam like that. All right, I see Nicholas Polomenakis is joining us on Facebook. Hey, Nicholas, thanks for joining us. Somebody's asking if I only do sidereal astrology. This is actually tropical, so I'm looking at the zodiac from the tropical standpoint for the purpose of this. Somebody's asking about Uranus moving into Taurus in March, and I'm going to have to put that off until next month for the horoscopes for... That's one of the challenges I have, is wanting to talk about, you know, I can see that Uranus transit coming up, and that's going to be major, especially for those of you with Taurus rising. And I hate to leave you guys on a bit of a cliffhanger, but, you know, I don't want to use up all my material for March either. Otherwise, I won't have anything to talk about when I do this again next month. All right, thanks everybody for writing the promo code. I can't really post comments here, but thanks for writing out the AP15 code on Periscope and on Twitter. I think that's pretty much it. I think I've got to wrap it up here for the horoscopes for February for those of you with Taurus and Taurus Rising. So thanks everybody for joining me today. I appreciate it. Once again, this is a bit of an experiment with doing live streaming simultaneously on Twitter, on Facebook, and on YouTube. But if you guys enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe to me on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook, or all three. If it goes well, I'll be back again next month. And yeah, otherwise be sure to subscribe to the Astrology Podcast at theastrologypodcast.com. All right, thanks everybody for watching, and I will see you again next month for the horoscopes for March. Bye.